The first thing I noticed wasn't the trucks or the dust. It was the way my front porch looked at me like a stranger. I had flown back from Denver with my speech still ringing in my head. For 35 years I had built other people's futures as a business consultant, steering failing companies through dangerous stretches and teaching founders how to survive their worst mornings. The summit offered rare recognition. I spoke about resilience and recovery to a room of young managers and entrepreneurs. Afterwards, people queued to thank me and tell me that a sentence I had shared had changed how they would approach their work. The small applause felt simple and honest, the sort of validation you do not always get when the work is mostly one-on-one counsel and late-night spreadsheets. I treated myself to 2 extra days in the city to walk streets I did not always see, to let the summit's energy settle before returning to the life that was waiting at home. If you're watching this right now, I want to know, where are you tuning in from? Drop your location in the comments and share your thoughts as the story unfolds. I'll be reading through your takes, and I'm curious to see how far this story is reaching. When my street finally came into view, the sense of wrongness struck me. Trucks lined the curb, men in neon vests carried beams, and the neighborhood's hush was replaced by a steady roar of saws and hammers. My lawn was scattered with pallets and sawdust. Someone had staked off my driveway as if I were an absentee owner being discovered. I parked, heart pounding, and walked up the path with that odd mixture of disbelief and dread. The front door stood open. Light fell into rooms I recognized but could not inhabit. Workers moved through the house with purpose, voices carrying instructions. The sharp scent of fresh paint cut through the memory of the home I had left. The sofa where I sometimes napped with a cup of tea was wrapped in plastic. The photographs I had framed and the quilts I had mended for years were boxed and labeled. At the center of the upheaval stood a woman with a clipboard, poised and remarkably calm. It was Ivana's mother. She looked at me as if examining a painting hung a little off-kilter. "We are making it fit for my daughter and me," she told me, as if she were informing me about the weather. The workers glanced up then away, like pieces on her chessboard. Her composure irritated a raw and unfamiliar part of me. Charlie was inside, shaking hands with a contractor. He saw me, and for a moment surprise flickered across his face. The expression vanished and his practiced smile returned. "Hey Mom," he called, as if that simple greeting could erase the scene around us. The sound of his voice should have been a relief. Instead it sank like a stone. The shock was not a melodrama. There were no slammed doors or raised voices at the threshold. Instead, the quiet machinery of a life was being altered. My marriage had ended years earlier. After the divorce, I doubled down on work and devoted myself to raising Charlie. I did the late-night homework with him, took him to his first interviews, and saved for college expenses. I promised him certain things, small daily protections and one large, unscripted pledge that the duplex would be his when he wanted to put down roots. It was a mother's assurance, not a deed, offered in a moment of faith. Now that pledge seemed to have new claimants. I moved through the rooms like a ghost visiting former haunts. Dust hung in shafts of light, and the sound of drilling felt obscene, an intimate noise made public. I steadied my voice and asked for an explanation. Ivana's mother offered a polite smile. "We are renovating," she said. "We are making adjustments so the house suits a young family." The phrase young family stung. My daughter had moved away years before to live with her father, and that absence remained tender. Charlie had married Ivana only weeks before I left for the summit. I had stood at their reception as if bridging old and new lives, and in quieter moments I told myself small reconciliations might be possible. At that event I had promised Charlie the house, thinking that promise would be a bond, a gift that kept us connected rather than severed. I asked where my things were being stored. A worker, embarrassed, indicated the boxes, books, framed diplomas, quilts, the small objects that quietly define a life. "We were told to clear space," he muttered. Those words echoed in the hollow of the room. Told by whom? The implication felt corrosive. The first hot flash of betrayal burned bright, and then receded into a dull ache. Charlie, who once wanted to sleep in my bed during thunderstorms, stood at the center of my living room as though he had been called to witness his own replacement. Words clotted in my throat, heavy with years of memory. Before I could shape them into sentences, Ivana's mother stepped close with the efficiency of someone who knows how to open doors. "We just want a fresh start," she said. We'll be respectful. You'll still have a space. Respectful. Space. Language softening what had been done to look like generosity. I left without raising my voice because fury can make you careless, and I wanted clarity, not a scene that would leave me weak. I drove to a friend's house and sat in the dark, staring at the glow of a street lamp, replaying every detail. In that stillness, the hurt closed around me like a fist, and then slowly, a steadier energy replaced the hurt. Disbelief gave way to resolve. I would not back down tonight. This was only the beginning. The knock at the kitchen door that afternoon sounded polite enough to be meaningless. A neighborly rap about a parcel. I opened it to find Ivana standing on the stoop with a polite smile and an air of triumph. Behind her was her mother, clipboard in hand, the two moving together like a practice team. I invited them in because manners and curiosity demanded it. The living room still echoed with construction noise, paint fumes in the air, workers moving through the house as if this were their own site. Ivana glanced at our family photographs with a neutral expression. "We wanted to check on the progress," she said. "We are excited for the changes." The sentence arrived with the casualness of someone announcing a pleasant surprise. Her mother took over the narrative. "Charlie arranged the contract with the contractor," she explained. "We began while you were away to make the place comfortable for our family." The words landed with the weight of intention. A contractor's order with Charlie's name was produced. The document detailed the scope of work and a payment schedule, but contained no transfer of ownership. "Who authorized this?" I asked. Ivana offered a rehearsed apology. "We thought it was best to begin so you would have a finished home when you returned," she said. "You travel a lot, and we wanted to help." Her tone was meant to soothe. Instead, it felt like a justification for replacing my life. The conversation shifted quickly from explanation to accusation. I told them plainly that the house was mine, and that renovations without my explicit consent were unacceptable. Ivana's mother responded with clinical calm, suggesting they had been considerate. She proposed keeping a private suite for me, promising I would not be displaced. "You will still have space here," she assured. I asked how the payments had been arranged. They claimed to have used savings, and that Charlie had agreed. A work order is not a deed, but the document and their readiness suggested premeditation. I felt the sting of betrayal bruise into anger. Charlie arrived as the afternoon wore on, and took up the role I had hoped he would not, arbiter. He stood between us, arms folded, and told me that I had once promised him the house, and that he had a right to begin his life there with Ivana. He framed their actions as practical. Insulation needs, safety issues, and the costs that came with delaying work. When I asked why he had not told me in advance, he said they had discussed it and believed they were acting in the family's best interest. I tried to make him see what it felt like to return and find your home rearranged. He listened but then spoke of his own needs, of wanting a stable home for his new wife. His voice was steady and unmoved by memory. He did not apologize. Instead, he defended their choices as responsible. Attempts at compromise followed. They proposed a schedule that preserved a private room for me, temporary accommodations while heavy work was done, and an offer to cover disruption costs. Those gestures read to me like a way to box in my objections rather than address the core violation. They had answers for each worry, prepared and ready. The argument grew sharper. Ivana accused me of being selfish and unwilling to share the space I had promised. Her mother suggested I was clinging to a sentimental claim that harmed the new family. I accused them of entitlement and of taking advantage of my absence. The language between us hardened into barbs. They produced a contractor's invoice that listed materials, a timeline, and a clause referencing owner confirmation. The document carried my son's name as the signatory. On a small folding table, Ivana had laid out paint swatches and fabric samples in colors that matched her apartment. She described an open-plan living space, a shared garden, and a family suite that would make life easier for everyone. Her mother spoke of stability, of saving money on rent, and of growing old under one roof. Their earnestness came across as strategy. The care with which they decided what I should want felt like a cut. That night I sat alone in the darkened kitchen and listened to the distant thud of a hammer. The house smelled of paint and possibility, but it felt like a life being rewritten without my consent. The most painful part was not the construction but the certainty that those I loved had decided they could proceed without me. The polite smiles and meticulous plans concealed the consequence. I had been made optional in a life I had built. The unwanted welcome had clarified one thing in a way nothing else could. The real battle would not be about wood and plaster. It would be about memory, entitlement, and whether love could be weaponized into permission. This house carries the weight of my choices, and in it are the bones of the decisions that define my life. To understand the betrayal that shook me to the core, you must first understand how we arrived here. Charlie was born small and fierce, the child who came after a marriage that had frayed itself into civility. His father and I loved each other in a way that tolerated differences more than it bridged them, and eventually we consented to separate. Divorce did not erase responsibility. The house became a ledger where I kept accounts of devotion. I worked double shifts, took on consultations, and learned to balance budgets so that meals were steady and shoes were on the right feet. I remember midnight feedings and the long nights when he had nightmares. I remember falling asleep with a lamp still on, watching him breathe, feeling the high cost of a life rebuilt. I scheduled my days so that he had stability. When he scraped his knee and cried, I was the hand that bandaged him. When he made his first mortgage payment as an adult, I cried silently behind the newspaper. These are not grand confessions. They are the small, ordinary acts that knit a parent to a child. As he grew, so did his independence. High school brought new friends, weekend jobs, and the first time he stayed out too late and returned apologetically aware of his mother's worry. I made room for his life to expand into the world. I encouraged college applications and taught him how to negotiate for himself. Still, there were moments when his priorities diverged from mine, the quiet drift of a son becoming his own man. When he met Ivana, I tried to like her. She was younger, confident, and polished in ways I at first mistook for charm. They met at a course and began spending nights at our house because there was space. My pattern of absences, frequent trips and sometimes a new partnership, meant rooms were available. At first I admired how quickly their bond formed. Their engagement followed a measured courtship, and then a wedding that gathered family and, briefly, a fragile sense of reunion as my ex-husband and our daughter came for a few hours of civility. Her mother, however, left me unsettled from the start. There was a precision to her manners, an ability to make negotiation seem like kindness. She asked questions in a way that quietly measured and catalogued. When she complimented a piece of furniture or admired a photo, she did so with the warmth of someone cataloging a future for herself. I did not want to be suspicious. I smiled and tried to meet her generosity with restrained grace, but small incidents pricked at me. A passing comment about the attic's potential storage, an offhand suggestion about rearranging books. It all registered like faint prints. I had promised Charlie the duplex the way parents promise a child security, with a gesture rather than a legal document. I wanted him to have a place where he could anchor his future. It was a covenant made in love and in the belief that what is given will be cherished, not turned into leverage. I did not dream they would turn a mother's kindness into pressure. Promises between family members carry a unique gravity. They are built on trust, history, and memory. When a promise is broken, it often shatters more than the object at its center. It fractures the currency of reliance. The house was never merely brick and timber. It contained late-night talks, whispered fears, the folding of laundry on a Tuesday after a hard day. To have it deconstructed by people who claimed they were protecting it felt like watching a diary burned in slow motion. I tried to reach out to Ivana when they first began the changes. I suggested coffee, that we talk about plans, that there might be ways to preserve cherished items while updating other parts. Ivana agreed to a meeting, and then canceled twice. When we finally sat face to face, the conversation felt scripted. She listened politely and then steered back to practicalities, timelines, contractors, budgets. There was no curiosity about the quilt on the armchair, or the framed program from my first lecture. At times I feared that my efforts at generosity had been misread as permission. Had my openness made me vulnerable in a way I had not foreseen? Had my promise to my son been a larger invitation than I intended? These were the questions that haunted me in the days after the workers arrived, and before I decided what to do next. The ache of being misunderstood, and the sting of betrayal combined until they formed a plan. I would not yield my home to silence or to polite theft. Understanding the past does not excuse the present, but it explains the lines that have been drawn. My son's choices did not happen in a vacuum. They emerged from a lattice of habits, absences, and an unguarded pledge. That lattice was fraught now, and the seams were pulling apart. I would fight to keep the house's heart intact, even if it cost me everything I truly owned. The word promise sounds small when spoken, but it carries a kind of gravity that law often does not recognize. In the hours after the workers arrived, I kept returning to that single pledge I had given Charlie. The quiet assurance that one day the duplex would be his. It was a mother's vow, offered in a moment of hope and certainty, not a legal instrument. Yet the sentence had been used to justify action, and to their defenders a promise felt like precedent. I had never meant to abandon my home while I still lived in it. The promise was meant to be a hinge for the future, not an invitation to immediate transfer. Perhaps I had been naive to assume that family obligations would suffice. When you build something with your hands and your hours, you expect memory and gratitude to protect it. I expected my son to understand what it means to honor the work behind a home. To understand the practicalities, I called an old contact at a real estate firm. He was careful in his reply. A verbal promise is rarely enough to transfer title, he told me. But if someone can show they relied on that promise to their detriment, equitable doctrines could complicate things. If funds were spent, materials bought, or major labor performed, a judge might examine who acted in reliance. His advice was crisp and procedural. Document, document, document. That instruction turned my grief into a checklist. I began photographing the progress, noting contractors' names, and asking for invoices and receipts where I could. I cataloged the items that mattered. Quilts with stitches my mother taught me, framed programs from speeches, a chipped teacup that had accompanied my late nights of reading. Writing the list felt like a small act of reclamation. Among my friends, one neighbor became a quiet counsel. She had navigated messy inheritances in her own family, and she listened without judgment. You have to decide what you are willing to lose, she told me one afternoon over coffee. Her words were a scalpel. I had to wrestle honestly with the cost of defense. The law offered options but not comfort. A lawyer might file an injunction to halt work or to prevent unilateral alterations that might produce irreparable harm. The police could be called if trespass had occurred. Insurance companies could be notified about unauthorized renovations. But each route promised friction and the possibility of public exposure. The idea of courtrooms and depositions and strangers questioning intimate family details repulsed me. I did not want to reduce my life to exhibits on a table. Still, doing nothing felt impossible. The violation had been so blatant that passivity would feel like consent. A mother who allowed her home to be taken did not feel like a mother who had protected the life she had built. There were moral and symbolic lines here that mattered to me as much as receipts. Practical solutions tempted me. Could we sign a written occupancy agreement that allowed limited renovations while protecting my rights? Could we draw boundaries that defined exactly what renovations were permitted and for how long? Those seemed sensible and fair, but they required willingness to negotiate in good faith, and the evidence so far suggested that good faith might be thin. In the middle of these options, I drafted a letter that was neither an attack nor surrender. It stated my history with the house, clarified that no formal transfer of title had occurred, and requested a pause to discuss a written living arrangement. I dated the letter, made a copy, and placed it in my briefcase. The act of forming words into a clear position felt strategic and dignifying. I also thought ahead to community perception. Neighbors had already started to whisper. Some offered sympathy. Others questioned whether I had been impractical in making promises without documentation. The rumor mill showed how personal disputes can quickly become public. It made me want clarity on paper, an agreed-upon path forward that would leave little room for gossip. The duplex itself held a lineage. My mother once rented a room to a violinist who taught on Saturdays. The hallway smelled of lemon oil and old paper, and each floorboard contained a memory. Losing that history would mean losing a map to myself. So I continued to document everything, drafted the letter, and steeled myself for the steps I might have to take. I was not eager for war, but I would no longer be optional. If they wanted a fight, they would find I had patience, proof, and the will to use both. The day of the argument arrived like a storm with no thunder. Tension had been building in small moments. Curt answers at the dinner table, text messages left unread, the way conversations skirted my questions with ready rehearsals. When the confrontation finally occurred, it was less a single blow than a series of small cuts that left a deeper wound. It began over a simple thing. The placement of my mother's portrait on the living room wall. A contractor had removed it to patch plaster. And when I asked where it would be returned, I was told the new layout placed it in a different room. That small relocation became a symbol. I asked for the portrait back. They suggested a compromise. I refused. The rest followed. I called Charlie into the kitchen and asked him to explain why he had allowed his wife's mother to coordinate such sweeping changes without my consent. He stood with the tiredness of a man who believed his choices were reasonable. "Mom," he said, "we have been practical. We need space for our lives. You promised me the house. This is how a family settles in." His words were steady and made as much sense as the sun rising. I told him that a promise is a living thing between people, not a permission slip to rearrange someone else's life. I reminded him of nights we had burned the midnight oil together, and the sacrifices made so he could make his own way. He listened, but his eyes were elsewhere, focused on a future that no longer held the same shelf space for memory. The conversation slid into all the old places. Resentments about absences, about choices I had made, about the ways we had tried to repair a broken marriage by working harder rather than healing. Charlie mentioned my travel, the times I had stayed away, and did so without bitterness and without shame. He used the word practical often, as if good intentions had to submit to efficiency. At one point our voices rose. He accused me of playing with sentiment, of making ownership an idol. I accused him of reckless entitlement, of handing our family to strangers. He defended his actions as duty to his new household. Ivana remained largely silent at the kitchen doorway, but when she spoke it was with the clarity of someone who had rehearsed her lines. "We are not trying to hurt you," she said. "We are trying to build a life. This makes sense for us." The argument spiraled into symbolic territory. We fought not simply over paint and portraits, but over who had the right to shape the narrative of our shared past. He accused me of clinging to the past. I accused him of abandoning it. Each accusation stripped away a layer of what remained between parent and child. Neighbors knocked on the door eventually, drawn by the muffled loudness. They would later say they had heard a family dispute, and then quiet, as if we had exhausted each other with words and then ran out of breath. The workers went about their business with a mechanical indifference, and the contractor kept an eye on timelines. To them it was a project. To me it was the undoing of a life. At one point Charlie said he felt torn but believed he had to choose a path. "I can't dismantle our future for the sake of sentimentality," he told me, as calmly as someone reading from a prepared script. His voice had the dangerous slipperiness of someone convinced he was doing the right thing. He did not ask forgiveness. He did not offer to negotiate on terms that would have left me feeling respected. In the rawness that followed, I tried to find a foothold of reason. I asked for a meeting with Ivana and her mother to draw up boundaries in writing. They gave me polite assurances and then proceeded with the contractors as though the meeting were a formality. I insisted on documentation, on a signed agreement that would designate which parts of the house were mine and which were under construction. They hemmed and hawed, and then produced a plan that deputized them as occupants with rights born of action. A plan that read like retroactive justification. When I told Charlie this felt like betrayal rather than negotiation, he grew impatient. "You keep talking about betrayal," he said. "We are building a life. Can't you see that?" His words felt like a verdict. After the argument he left for a walk and later for work. He did not stay to help me box a few things or to stand in the doorway with me and demand respect. He left with his hands full of rationalizations and a future mapped in a way that excluded me. I would not let this stand unchallenged. The coming days would test not just law but what love had cost us in memory. That night I sat at the kitchen table and realized that the confrontation had clarified everything. I had no illusions about his priorities. He chose the life he and his wife were building over the person who had given him the foundation to build it upon. It was not only painful, it was a clean severing of a certain kind of trust. The battle lines were now clear, and so were the choices I had to make. I woke into a house that felt unfamiliar, as if someone had rearranged the furniture of my life while I slept. The morning after our argument, I moved through rooms that looked the same, but felt altered. Quilts I had folded for years were boxed. The hallway smelled of paint and sawdust, ordinary scents that now read as trespass. Being an outsider in your own home arrives in small slights. A picture slightly askew, a lamp left in the garage, a contractor calling me the client, as though our history were a footnote. Those minor shifts added up until the house no longer held my memories, but displayed them like props. That realization cut deeper than any single insult. From the back steps I watched neighbors go about their days. Some offered sympathetic smiles. Others averted their faces. Community became a temperature reading, warm on certain porches, cool on others. People whispered. The private loss was becoming public. The rituals that anchor a life were disturbed. My breakfast corner was rearranged, and my favorite chair bore a primer smudge. The house, stitched together by ordinary acts and late-night repairs, now resembled a set being readied by strangers. I questioned where vulnerability began. Had my travel and work left openings? Had my promise to Charlie been too casual? Regret rubbed against resolve. I would not surrender to guilt. I began to document. Photographs of workers, lists of removed items, names and dates on invoices I could see. The act of recording steadied me. Facts can be wielded where memories alone cannot. Tom, my partner, became quiet ballast. He suggested contacting the old developer and reminded me that bills, utilities, and voter registration all establish ties to a place. His practical tenderness helped me shape a plan. My daughter called from across the country and urged me to gather deeds and statements. Her blunt questions turned emotion into strategy. Some neighbors became allies. One elderly woman wrote a note recounting the years I had come in rain or snow to school meetings and school plays. Another snapped photos of workers removing fixtures. Their small testimonies formed an informal ledger around my claim. I tried conciliatory moves, polite letters requesting a pause in renovations until we could meet, proposals for mediation. In return, I received assurances that sounded like solutions, but did not address structural changes. They offered temporary rooms and promises, but not the legal clarity I now craved. So I made lists of non-negotiables. My mother's portrait above the mantel, the cast iron pan from my father's kitchen, shelves of books with my margin notes. These were less possessions than anchors of identity. Turning them into explicit demands felt like staking a flag in a territory that memory defined. Anger brewed, but so did clarity. The house's layout stopped being mere floor plan. It mapped a life. That reframing let me plan with precision. If I had to fight, I would use evidence, witness statements, and a clear inventory. The outsider in her own home learned to move without melodrama. I cataloged, spoke with neighbors, and drafted requests to pause work. Each step was small, legalistic, and necessary. The fight would not be sudden. It would be methodical. By the time the chapter closed, the house still smelled faintly of paint, and the workers' boots left marks on the tile. Yet I no longer drifted like a ghost through rooms. I moved with the economy of someone who had decided to defend what mattered. I would not be reclaimed by sentiment alone. I would be reclaimed by proof. Night amplifies small things until they loom large. I drove to Tom's apartment, a modest place with a sagging sofa and sun-hungry plants. He made coffee and offered quiet. His silences are companionship. The city slept while my mind refused to. I lay on his sofa and let the day replay. Workers in my rooms, my son's indifferent face, Ivana's mother with a clipboard, and sleep never came. I brewed more coffee and wrote lists on scraps. Anger focuses when it has a scaffolding. The scaffolding for me became names, dates, photographs, and receipts. I cataloged the small histories that anchored the house. A chipped teacup brought back from a honeymoon. A faded program from a college lecture with my name in the credits. A cast iron pan with my father's initials. Writing felt like defense. It transformed private anguish into something actionable. I called an attorney I had consulted years earlier. The man answered and said plainly, "Document everything. If renovations are proceeding without consent, Notify the police and consider a temporary restraining order. You might have a claim for unjust enrichment if they spent money relying on a promise. Legal language translated emotion into steps. The attorney's words steadied me. I made a list. Call insurance, file a police report, contact the developer who had once overseen the duplex, and ask a contractor I trusted to assess reversibility. I also wrote down neighbors willing to vouch for my residency. Tom sat nearby and steadied my breath. Storming in won't help, he said. Build the paper trail first. He had a corporate habit of turning problems into sequences. Now we applied it to a life. Midnight sharpened memory into images. I thought of repainting a wall the year after the divorce. The way I held the roller and pushed paint into the corners while the house relinquished its ache. That wall held a thin shadow, a mark of my midnight labor. I imagined it being covered by a new color chosen by someone else, the shadow of work painted over. A swatch of paint suddenly read as an erasure. At 2 a.m. I drove back to the duplex to see how much progress had been made. In the sodium glare of street lamps, the house looked strange. Hammers sounded like distant drums. I walked the perimeter and took photos, frames that could later speak in a language insurers and courts would accept. The act felt clandestine and oddly necessary. I moved quietly, a woman documenting the evidence of her own life. Back at Tom's, I composed a letter to Charlie. I wanted to avoid pure accusation. I wanted instead to open a window for him to stop what had begun. I wrote about history, late-night talks, the way the house had been my safety net, the years of work that stitched it together. And then in a second paragraph I wrote about the steps I would take if renovations continued without written consent. The letter tried for a balance of sternness and invitation to repair. The insomnia had its own iron discipline. The night permitted uninterrupted thinking. I turned what had been raw emotional pain into a sequence of moves aimed at preservation. The patience I had used running companies became useful in this domestic conflict. I scheduled calls, typed emails, and reviewed old utility bills to build a narrative of residence. At 4 I called my old contractor and asked him to come the next morning to inspect. He promised a written assessment and candid language. If they've opened walls without permits, that'll be costly to undo, he said. He agreed to document what he saw and to write an opinion about whether changes were reversible and what permits would be required. A friend suggested mediation. Another urged immediate legal action. I weighed both and decided on a measured path. Gather evidence, assess structural impact, and then act. The goal was to stop irreversible harm while preserving the possibility of reconciliation if it existed. An hour of dozing on Tom's sofa produced a dream where the garden outside my house had been replanted by strangers. Waking, the dream left the sensation that reality had been rearranged without permission. Yet I felt different than I had that evening, less raw, clearer. The overnight hours had calmed the initial shock into a usable reserve of energy. At dawn I folded the notes, arranged the documents, and placed them in a folder I would carry to the duplex. The morning light made everything look less ominous and more negotiable. The key was not to be impulsive. I would act, but with purpose. The sleepless night had given me a weapon I had not expected: structure. I would not be pushed out without a fight. Action requires knowledge. That morning, folder in hand, I walked to the small police precinct 2 blocks away. The official building smelling faintly of lemon cleaner and old coffee. I was met by Officer Ramirez, a woman with steady eyes and an efficient pen. I explained the situation. Unauthorized renovations, workers on my property, verbal promises twisted into immediate action. I tried to be precise: dates, times, contractor names, because precision makes a complaint legible. Ramirez listened and typed. "We'll do a report for unauthorized entry and property interference," she said. "If they lack your consent, we can ask them to pause." Her tone was procedural, which was both comforting and bothersome. Comforting because it meant someone was taking it seriously. Bothersome because the language of procedure smoothed the emotional rawness I felt. The police advised I document evidence and avoid direct confrontations with workers. They explained that while trespass is a criminal matter, many property disputes are civil in nature and must be resolved in court. They provided a case number and suggested I request an officer to serve a formal notice if the contractor refused to pause. I left with photocopies of the report and an odd, bureaucratic calm. Some parts of life become a sequence of forms. Next I called my insurance company. The agent asked for claim details, and whether the contractor had permits. When I said I didn't know, the agent suggested I contact the city building department to check for any permit applications and log unauthorized alterations with the insurer. They put an advisory note on my policy and sent an inspector to follow up in the coming days. The legal path became clearer when I spoke with the developer who had built the duplex years ago. He was blunt in a way that felt like solidarity. A verbal promise is rarely a transfer of title, he said. But any major work without written consent can be contested. If they're altering structure, the city will care about permits, and the courts will care about irreparable changes. He suggested I gather the original plans and bring them to a lawyer who handled property disputes. Armed with forms, numbers, and the developer's contact, I called my attorney. He recommended filing an injunction to halt work that could not be undone, like altering load-bearing walls or permanently changing plumbing or electrical systems. He warned that injunctions require evidence of potential irreparable harm, and that the court often weighs the harm against the disruption an injunction causes to others. It felt like a balance scale that might tilt either way. We discussed immediate steps: preserve evidence, gather witness statements, request the contractor's permit history, and draft a demand letter giving notice to cease unauthorized work. The lawyer offered to draft a formal letter by the next day, and to prepare the paperwork for an emergency hearing should the need arise. Legal counsel felt like a lever. Small actions could create large effects. That afternoon, a building inspector from the city came by at my request. He inspected permits and compared them to what was happening inside. He photographed exposed wiring and unpermitted structural openings and made notes. His presence alone changed the atmosphere. Subcontractors suddenly looked less at ease when told a city inspector was on site, and that there could be fines or work stoppages for unpermitted alterations. I felt the law as a texture around us, at once cold and protective. It did not wipe away the betrayal, but it offered a framework to stop the slow erasure. The city's paperwork and the police report turned private grievance into public fact. That mattered. Memory and sentiment alone are fragile. Documents are harder to deny. At home, neighbors watched and whispered. The in-law, who had been so assured before, now wore a face edged with something else: worry maybe, or calculation. She sent texts more frequently, asking for meetings, promising that nothing would be permanent. I allowed myself to hear nothing but the formality of legal steps. If she wanted to negotiate, she would have to come to a table where paper mattered. That evening, the contractor paused work when the inspector and a cop arrived to confirm the status. Workers put down their tools. The sound of saws and drills diminished, as if someone had pulled a thread. For a brief moment the house breathed differently. But law is not a single decisive blow. It is a series of small levered moves. The injunction was not yet issued, the insurance claim still pending, the developer's notes into my attorney. Each step required patience and follow-through. The next morning I would meet with the lawyer to review the demand letter and prepare witness statements. Still, there were stinging moments. When I spoke to Charlie on the phone, he accused me of humiliating them. "You brought the police?" he asked, incredulous. "You could have talked to me." The conversation was short and cold. He did not see the act of documentation as defense. He saw it as escalation. Later, as dusk blurred the edges of the day, I sat with the file folder on my lap and felt a curious mixture. That the law had become a kind of ally, that bureaucracy could be used to protect memory, and that documents, dry and impersonal, could restore a form of justice. The house's safety was not fully returned, but the scales were tipping back toward order. I would use every lawful tool to protect what I had built, and to honor the life it held forever. They thought they had begun a new life in my rooms, but they had not anticipated a simple sound I would never forget. A precise knock at their door, the kind that carries authority. It came mid-afternoon while Ivana and her mother were overseeing a final paint change, and while the contractor argued about tiles with a subcontractor. I watched from the driveway as an officer in uniform and a woman from the city building department approached the porch. The workers straightened. The air thinned. When the officer spoke, his voice had a clarity I had not expected. "Ma'am, We have a report here regarding unauthorized renovations at this address. We need to speak with the occupants and inspect the work." The clipboard he held read like an instrument of consequence. Ivana looked at her mother, a flash of panic crossing her features. They had been confident all week, but confidence is a brittle armor when official papers arrive. The inspector stepped inside, and the contractor offered a permit folder. He flipped through it, then stopped. The folder did not match the scope of work underway. He checked the city database on his tablet, and it returned no active permit covering the structural alterations we had observed. His face was flat. "This work appears unpermitted," he announced. "You must pause until the proper permits are filed and reviewed." The contractor's shoulders sank. The worker's chatter dimmed. An officer interviewed me on the porch first, noting details I had already provided. He asked calmly about dates, who had given permission, and whether I had documentation of ownership. My receipts, my developer's notes, and the police report I had filed the day before became instruments in a new conversation. When the officer knocked on the contractor's clipboard, the weight of procedure did what my words had struggled to do. It moved their plans from private certainty to public scrutiny. Ivana's mother stepped forward with a composed apology that felt rehearsed. "We thought we were improving the place," she said. There was no ill intent. Her voice trembled slightly. The inspector documented exposed wiring and unpermitted openings with a patient thoroughness. He photographed, noted serial numbers on equipment, and marked the places where a permit might be required. The contractor, who had been fierce in his timeline, found himself muted by the presence of officials. The decisive moment came when they asked for the project ledger and payment records. A subcontractor, nervous, admitted that a down payment had been made by a relative of Ivana's family in cash. There was no recorded charge to the property, no invoice under the address owner's name. The ledger suggested reliance on a narrative rather than legal right. The officer's expression hardened. He asked for identification. Records were taken, and a temporary hold was placed on further alterations. For a while it felt surreal. Workers stacked their tools in silence. The house's noises diminished as if someone had cut power to a part of the world. Ivana wept quietly. Her mother sat with her hand pressed to her mouth. Charlie arrived later, face pale, trying to measure outrage and embarrassment. He did not yet understand that what he had thought was inside a family arrangement had become a matter of civic concern. After paperwork was signed and evidence recorded, Officer Ramirez, who had helped me file the prior report, explained that there might be criminal charges if the investigation found deliberate fraud or forced entry, but that often these matters became civil suits over property rights and permits. She said, gently, that the city could levy fines against the contractor, and that unpermitted work could be ordered reversed. The words sounded legal and final. Ivana's mother was taken for questioning when the officer discovered that funds had been moved through an account linked to a different address, and when witness statements suggested she had orchestrated parts of the operation while I was away. The short walk to the patrol car looked like a fall from the composure she had shown on the first day. For a moment I felt a complicated mix. Vindication, sorrow, and a dull worry about the fallout. To see someone detained is never a simple triumph. Workers were dismissed, equipment removed, and the renovation halted. The contractor agreed to a temporary pause pending permit review, and the inspector posted a notice that required work to stop. It felt like a win detailed in bureaucratic terms, hardly dramatic but effective. That evening, the neighbors gathered in small clusters on the sidewalk, voices quivering with gossip. Some called it a protective act. Others whispered that I had taken things too far. Social opinion can bend a situation in ways formal documents cannot always predict. I stood on my porch with a cup of tea cooling in my hand, and listened to the street's low hum. The immediate legal victory came with costs. Ivana's mother was released the following day after preliminary questioning, and the involvement of lawyers. The police explained that release was not uncommon while investigations proceeded. The contractor faced fines and a permit backlog when the city reviewed the files. Charlie and Ivana were served with a notice to vacate within 7 days. They reacted with anger and humiliation rather than contrition. In the quiet that followed, I felt the house breathe differently. The saws were silent. The rooms were still. The law had intervened in a way that took the momentum out of their plans. Yet the intervention did not stitch the relationship back together. It bought time and space, but it also pronounced a public rupture. That knock on the door had been small and precise, but its echo would be long. It changed the course of things, not by grand spectacle, but by measured steps that forced secret plans into the light. The night after, I slept with a different kind of quiet. Wary, guarded, but no longer passive. Indeed, the days after the knock were noisy in ways the house itself could not muffle. Word traveled in the neighborhood like a current. Grocery aisles brought tight-lipped conversations. Friends who had once been casual offered cautious sympathy, others withdrew. Social media, quietly at first, picked up whispers and turned them into threads. Someone wrote a long post about entitlement and the dangers of verbal promises. Another defended me as a mother protecting her home. The story began to divide people into camps. At breakfast, a neighbor delivered a casserole and stayed long enough to express worry. "I never thought I'd see something like this here," she said. Her eyes were full of the kind of gentle shock that carries allegiance. Another neighbor who had previously driven his kids past our porch and waved, now avoided eye contact. Small acts of community became statements of position. Inside the house there was a different hum. Workers had left tools and some covered furniture remained in the corners. The notice to stop work fluttered on the inside of the front door like a small flag. I moved slowly through rooms, taking stock. The emotional weight pressed at me intermittently. Victory on paper still felt like a wound in relationship. Charlie's absence was a physical ache. He had called that morning and said little beyond accusation. That I had embarrassed them and chosen procedure over family. Ivana and her mother tried to frame their loss as unintended consequence. Ivana posted an apology online that thanked neighbors for concern, and suggested she had overstepped in zeal rather than malice. Her post gathered both sympathy and skepticism. Her mother gave an interview to a local reporter, insisting they meant no harm, and that promises made within a family had been misinterpreted. Friends took sides in ways that surprised me. A college colleague who knew my background in consulting sent a private message offering to help craft a public statement. Another longtime friend suggested we avoid social media and not fan flames. The division felt strange because previous gatherings had been unremarkable: barbecues, book clubs, holiday plates. Now those shared rituals carried signal. Invitations dwindled. People measured their proximity to controversy. The contractor's company posted a cautious statement. They had been hired and had assumed permits would follow. They apologized for any oversight. The city's building department posted a notice about the importance of permits and the steps residents must take. Institutional machinery responded with neutral tones while private feelings sharpened. When I walked down to the bakery 2 days later, a woman I had once shared recipes with crossed the street to ask if I was holding up. Her voice was low and kind. These small acts of neighborliness were balm, but they also highlighted a social calculus. People wanted to know which side of a moral equation they'd be on if asked. It felt heavy to be the axis. Phone calls from extended family were a mixed bag, some defensive, others cautious. My sister called to say she supported me in principle, but couldn't get past the idea that paperwork might be an overreaction. My daughter, whose life had been distant, called with blunt practicality. "Get everything in writing, Mom. Don't let this hang." Her voice had steadiness. Her advice felt like armor. There were harsher things too. A blog post speculated that I had used resources to bully a younger couple. Comments argued about generational entitlement. Reputation is brittle. It can be scarred by rumor even when facts favor you. Underneath the public debate, private relationships cracked. Charlie visited once more before he left town permanently. We stood on the stoop and traded words that had no reconciliation in them. He was furious and hurt in equal measure. "You humiliated us," he said. "You could have spoken to me." I told him I had tried, and that his silence before the wedding had left me vulnerable. He would not hear that. He packed and left, and the house that had been a family center felt like a place of contested memory. The mother-in-law's brief detention rippled through our social circles. Her reputation had taken a hit. Neighbors whispered about audacity. Yet some defended her as a mother trying to secure family stability. She met with neighbors to explain intent and ask for mediation. Some agreed, others kept distance. At the community meeting, the room split along familiar lines. Residents who prized continuity and those who prioritized rules. The moderator insisted on civility, but the discussion exposed long-held resentments and alliances. I sat at the back and listened to neighbors tell different versions of our story. It was humbling to see how one event could be refracted into many truths. In weeks that followed, renovation spaces were cordoned off and inspected. The legal process moved at its own pace. Injunction hearings, insurance follow-ups, and the contractor's remediation plans took time. My mornings filled with calls and appointments. The public nature of our dispute complicated private mourning. Small consolations arrived too. A friend brought my grandmother's teapot, polished it, and set it on the kitchen table. I made tea and felt anchored by the object's familiarity. The house still held traces of our life together, and that reality mattered. The fallout had exposed the cost of protecting a home. Legal battles, public scrutiny, and the fracture of relationships you hoped would remain intact. I had preserved rooms and walls, but the cost was counted in human terms paper could not reconcile. I kept asking whether preserving the house was protection or stubbornness, and the answer remained complicated and open-ended. But I would endure this. He slammed the phone down with the force of someone dropping a verdict. When Charlie called that morning, I had been polishing a teacup that belonged to my grandmother. The receiver hitting its cradle sounded like punctuation. The conversation had been brittle. Accusations about public humiliation, paperwork over family. He spoke as if I had staged betrayal rather than defended a life. I tried to explain the facts. Workers tearing down walls without my consent, missing permits, invoices lacking my name. He could not hear detail. He heard only that his new life had been interrupted. Later he arrived in a car I did not recognize, walking with restless energy. Up close, tension was etched along his jaw. "Mom," he said finally, voice brittle. "You humiliated us in front of everyone. You brought the police." "The kind of mother who will not have her life dismantled without recourse," I answered. I kept my voice steady because anger needs shape. I wanted him to see that my actions were about protection, not punishment. He spoke of plans, children, stability, a home that felt secure. For him, the renovations were practical measures. I tried to feel his longing while holding to my right to the place that held my memories. He threatened to summon friends who could vouch they had tacit permission to start work. The offer felt like a negotiation over truth. He demanded I retract the complaints, withdraw reports, and allow them to proceed. To him, documentation read as obstruction. To me, retraction would erase the principle that one does not let others alter a life with impunity. I told him I loved him, and that protecting our home was not meant to wound. He listened and then, voice cracking, said he could not stay. He left that night with a duffel and a stare that suggested the break was deep. The house felt emptier, the heat of his presence gone. Neighbors reacted, some with notes of sympathy, others with distance. Social fabric strained. Attempts at mediation followed. Friends offered neutral ground, he refused. My daughter called and said quietly, "You did the right thing, Mom," though her voice carried the ache of someone who knows both loss and correctness. The days after his departure were full of logistics and small humiliations. An inspector's notice fluttered on my door like a flag, proof that official bodies had intervened. Mrs. Lane from next door handed me a note recounting years of my volunteer work. The mail carrier remembered seeing me sign for deliveries every month. Small acts became evidence. But public opinion tested me. A neighborhood meeting turned to jokes about entitlement. A local blog spun whispers into a thread about family ego. Comments were sharp. Reputation, I learned, is fragile and easily besmirched even when facts favor you. Charlie sent intermittent messages, snatches of anger, then silence. Once he accused me of choosing to be right instead of reconciled. I answered with an invitation to talk and review documents. He did not accept. Weeks later he returned to collect belongings, handling items with a curious care. He paused at my mother's portrait, fingertips on the frame. Neither of us spoke. He left. The sound of the door closing felt immense. The legal work continued. I filed affidavits, attended mediations, and kept a file that read like a ledger of a life. The contractor faced fines and delays as permits were reviewed. The halt bought time but did not stitch the tear between parent and son. In quiet hours I wandered rooms and listened for echoes. The teacup sat on its saucer, the quilt held its crease. These items were not consolation, but proof that not all of my life had been rewritten. Still, absence became a presence. A new weight that legal victories on paper could not lift. Neighbors offered small comforts, meals, sympathetic visits. A colleague drafted a calm public statement to defuse gossip. Another friend counseled restraint online. Community division reminded me that private disputes spill into public life in unpredictable ways. At night I dreamt of doors closing gently rather than slamming. The dream felt like a wish. Months later the contractor retreated, and the renovation halted. The practical wins felt necessary and pragmatic, but they were thin against the hollow left by my son. I had protected the house and paid a price measured in human terms. I wondered whether preservation of place justified the cost of a broken relationship. If reconciliation came, it would be private and slow. For now I carried both grief and a stubborn satisfaction. A proof that I had stood for what mattered even as I waited to see if time and patience could mend what paper could not. The envelope arrived like a formal breath, thin and undeniable. It was slid under my door in the late afternoon. The notice read plainly, the occupants were required to vacate within 7 days. It cited the inspector's findings, the lack of permits, and the city's order to cease work. Underneath the legal language lay a timetable that made the dispute suddenly concrete. When I called Charlie, he didn't answer. Later, when he came by, he held the paper and looked small in a way that made my chest ache. "We need more time," he said. 7 days is impossible. I understood the practical strain. Moving is expensive and humiliating, but I also knew the principle. Allowing their unilateral changes to stand would be a precedent I could not accept. Ivana's mother received the notice with practiced composure. Ivana wept quietly on the porch. Friends and family rushed to help, some offering storage and couches, others bristling and insisting they could fight the order. The community split into gestures of aid and strained silence. An appeal was filed on the 5th day seeking an extension and alleging inspector error. The filing bought time but also moved the dispute into the courtroom, where evidence and affidavits would matter. I prepared. The deed, dated photos, contractor invoices, and neighbor statements. The legal process was a slow, lucid kind of warfare. At the hearing, the judge listened as Ivana's mother described intentions and stability. My lawyer outlined missing permits, cash payments, and unpermitted structural changes. Courtrooms are not theatrical. They parse facts with deliberate care. The judge issued a temporary stay, 2 additional weeks to vacate while the appeal proceeded, and ordered that no further alterations be made. It was neither complete victory nor defeat. It was legal middle ground. The notice had enforced a boundary that persuasion hadn't. It demanded decisions. Where to store furniture, how to move boxes, who would take which pictures and memories. Neighbors organized to help with packing, but also watched as private lives were packed into public curbs. After the stay, frantic packing followed. Friends and neighbors pitched in with trucks and patience. They arranged books in boxes and wrapped heirlooms in newsprint. I watched as items I had once regarded as ordinary were treated like relics. It was strange and oddly consoling to see my life handled with care by people who were not obliged to do so. Ivana's mother then sued for an extension and filed an appeal alleging the inspector erred. The filing bought them time but placed the dispute under evidentiary scrutiny. Mediators were suggested. Papers were served. The legal fight centralized what had been private and messy. I attended the first hearing with a briefcase that felt like armor. The original deed, photos of the house before renovations, the contractor's invoices, and neighbor statements. The judge asked measured questions. Courts aren't dramatic, just slow and precise. The judge issued a temporary stay, allowing 2 weeks and ordering no further alterations. The stay gave them time but set the legal clock ticking. Meanwhile, the house remained under protective notice. No irreversible changes. All of this left emotional residue. I moved through the house with the mechanical care of someone cataloging a life. I labeled boxes of my own, recording which items mattered most. I spoke to the contractor's clients to understand how the company operated. I wrote down the names of workers who had been present the week I returned from my trip. The act of listing felt like making a ledger of truth. The 7-day notice had been a shock. It had forced packing, decisions, and a public theater of displacement. Yet it had also enforced boundaries I had not been able to maintain by persuasion. I had not wanted my son and his wife to leave in humiliation. I had wanted guidelines and legal clarity that would protect my home. Law in that moment offered the blunt practicality I needed. When Charlie left subsequently, after the stay and the hurried packing that followed, his absence felt final in a way the earlier arguments had not. The house became a place of measured silence, full of objects that had not moved. I had invoked the law and paid the price for that invocation. The questions that followed were not legal but moral. Had I protected a home at the cost of my son's presence? And would history record my decision as right or as a rupture that could never be mended? A rumor is a small stone that ripples across a pond until the whole surface is altered. Within days of the hearing, the story had found a life beyond our porch. A neighborhood blog picked up a piece about property disputes and family entanglement, and the comments section became a theater for judgment. Someone posted my photograph next to a caption that simplified my motives into a single line. Controlling mother blocks young family. Other posts painted Ivana as a victim of a vindictive parent. The nuance of our days, late-night conversations, small compromises, a verbal promise offered in love, disappeared into headlines. The public sense of scandal did something peculiar. It turned private grief into a marketable narrative. People began to take positions they would not have taken over a cup of coffee. Some neighbors returned casseroles with notes of support. Others avoided eye contact in the grocery store. Calls arrived from friends offering counsel. A few colleagues advised caution about social media. The world I had kept as a domestic sphere felt now like a stage under a fragile spotlight. Ivana's mother gave a local radio interview, a measured account about trying to secure stability for her daughter. The host asked live questions that had the clarity of a jury. Ivana posted an apology that collected both sympathy and suspicion. The couple's social circle rallied. My inbox filled with messages, some compassionate, others accusing. The public had decided to weigh our private history, and it preferred neat sides. In that noisy landscape, I found myself reflexively justifying the rightness of my actions. Yet justification never fully shields the tender parts of you that loved a son more than anything. I had to return to the facts, the permits, the dates, the contracts, because the internet is indifferent to nuance and generous to outrage. My lawyer suggested a carefully worded public statement, and I agreed. I did not want to continue a fight with friends and neighbors as bystanders. The statement was factual and restrained. It explained that the house had not been transferred, that work was unpermitted, and that legal steps had been taken to prevent irreversible alteration. I included a single line about my sadness at the personal cost. The release did little to silence comment, but it steadied certain conversations. The scandal also had a ripple effect on Ivana's work. She took time off after the harassment online escalated, and friends reported anonymous messages arriving at her inbox. While I had acted to protect my home, I did not want anyone hurt beyond what was necessary by legal consequence. The chorus of public opinion carried real harms that sometimes hit people who were not culpable in the ways commentators imagined. A few old friends called and said they had learned much about me in other ways. Stories of late-night consultations, the quiet charity work I had done in the community. Their reminders of another side of me were solace. But the broader conversation continued to skew into black and white commentary. The nuance of a fractured family seldom makes for good headlines. The scandal was also instructive. It taught me the price of making a principle public. Once private disputes enter the court of public opinion, they take on lives of their own. People add details, invent motives, and place themselves as moral arbiters. I learned to stop reading every comment. Watching an argument unfold online is like watching a small fire spread, sometimes best observed from a distance. Despite the online noise, practical life required attention. Mediation sessions continued, and the city's processes moved slowly. The Homeowners Association held a quiet meeting where members discussed the importance of permits and neighborly respect. A few residents urged reconciliation while others insisted that rules matter above sentiment. The balancing act between law and mercy became a recurring theme. Both are necessary and both are inadequate alone. I attended a small community forum, where people express frustration about blurred boundaries and the misuse of generosity. A young woman stood and said, "We often confuse kindness with permission." And the room hummed. I felt the nuance land. My promise to a son was kind, but kindness without boundaries can be exploited. In quieter moments, away from screens and headlines, I wrote letters to Charlie. They were small things, memories, requests for understanding, invitations to tea, and I mailed 3 before receiving a single return. Those letters were not performative. They were my way of building a bridge with ink and patience. Whether he ever crossed it I could not know. Eventually the headlines moved on. Neighbors resumed small courtesies, and some friendships softened. The public uproar had been sharp and expensive, but it could not remove years of memory from the house. In private, people who mattered kept bringing casseroles, sitting with me, and reminding me that not all stories end in ruin and healing. As the scandal grew and receded, I learned to tend to the parts of life that would remain no matter the headlines. The quilt on the armchair, the teacup on the saucer, the slow ritual of making tea. The house was no longer only a property. It had become a terrain of memory that public commentary could not entirely erase. The scandal had cost me privacy and peace, but it had also clarified who would stand with me when the news cycle moved on. The last suitcase looked smaller than memory. When Charlie packed that final night, it felt less like a carrying off of things than a collecting of the small, private pieces of his life that could be folded into boxes. He moved with a strange economy. Only what could be carried in a duffel, only what would not anchor him to a place he had chosen to leave behind. Watching him was like watching someone undo a long seam. Precise, reluctant, and inevitably final. He had refused mediation and then accepted it briefly, showing up in a suit that seemed too formal for what he had to say. We sat at a table in a neutral room where a mediator tried to chart a way forward. She suggested small rituals, an agreement to phone once a week, to attend a quarterly lunch, things that sounded hopeful but felt inadequate for the rupture that had occurred. Charlie spoke of confusion and pressure, and of not wanting conflict to define his marriage. He asked for distance. He wanted to reopen his life without the gravitational pull of family entanglements. In the end we agreed to nothing more than civility. He packed, I packed some boxes of my own, and we moved through rooms like 2 actors in a scene that neither had written. At one point he surprised me by folding my favorite blanket and tucking it into his bag. He paused at the door, looked back, and for a moment the man who had once asked to be tucked in during thunderstorms seemed younger. He left with a small, awkward hug that felt like a bridge burned slowly rather than suddenly. After the truck rumbled away, I walked the house and noted the traces he had left. A dent in a windowsill from a childhood baseball. A faint scuff on the staircase. A coffee ring where he would have breakfast on weekends. These small marks are the archive of ordinary intimacy. They do not vanish with departure. Neighbors brought casseroles out of habit, and cards arrived from people who could not know the tender geometry of our loss. The house held these offerings like offerings at an altar. I learned to make tea again, knowing someone else's taste would no longer be waiting. The rituals of domestic life shifted and settled into new grooves. Ivana and her mother left the city and took a job opportunity that allowed them distance and restart. The social media posts faded, replaced by other lives and headlines. I heard, through someone who knew someone, that Ivana had found work in another state, and that she was trying to find quiet. That knowledge produced a complicated relief. Relief that they were safe, sorrow that the family we might have been was no more. There was an odd sense of finality to the departure that legal orders could not achieve. The eviction notice had moved things forward. The mediations had structured the process, but the final leaving felt like a punctuation mark giving the sentence its closure. It was a scene that required mourning, an acknowledgement that some things, once broken, cannot be restored to their original shape. In the months that followed, I focused on restoration. I hired a contractor I could trust to assess and repair only what was necessary. I replastered a wall where a beam had been removed, and had the paint matched to the color that had weathered over years. These tasks were pragmatic and tender in equal measure. Restoring the house felt like healing small wounds. I also attended to my wider life. Work provided a helpful distraction. Consulting projects resumed and filled certain hours. Friends asked me to travel and to speak at a local event about professional resilience. I accepted because telling stories about surviving hard things is different from living through them. The public parts of my life became a structure I could inhabit while the private parts slowly convalesced. Letters arrived from Charlie sporadically, short notes rather than arguments. Sometimes he sent photos of strange new breakfasts he had learned to make. Other times he asked, gently, if we could meet. I replied with small notes asking for clarity and patience. Some replies came back, others did not. I learned that bridges sometimes appear as footpaths rather than highways. When the anniversary of his departure arrived, I baked his favorite bread and left a slice on the kitchen table, more an offering to memory than an invitation. The act felt ceremonial, private, and oddly freeing. The house, which had once been contested, had become my steward of memory. It held the past in its rooms and allowed me the space to decide how I would carry it forward. The final departure was a kind of death and a kind of release. It made me ask who we were beyond shared walls, and whether love is enough to bridge the practical and moral demands of adult life. In the end, I chose to keep the house and keep my history, to hold open a door that might be crossed one day, and to accept that some returns are quieter than departures. Sometimes at dusk I stand on the porch and imagine two versions of my son. One who stayed and one who left. Both live in the same memory. I have learned to live with both versions, keep the house as witness, and let time do its work in peace. Silence is not the opposite of noise. It is a presence of its own. After the departures and court documents and the social media flurries, the house settled into a different kind of life. Silence arrived not as absence but as a texture. The small sounds of brewing tea, the scrape of a chair across the floorboards, the slow rotation of a ceiling fan. I learned to listen to these sounds as if they were conversation partners, faint, forgiving, and patient. In the months that followed I kept routines because habits scaffold grief. Mornings began with coffee and the crossword that had been my father's practice. Afternoons were for work, evenings for calls with friends who had walked me through the legal processes, and then stayed when the cameras left. On certain Sundays I walked to the park where Charlie had learned to ride a bike, and I sat on a bench and watched children learning their own motions. The sight was both tender and difficult. I tried to disentangle the moral threads of what had happened. There was a clear rightness in protecting property and preventing an unlawful takeover. There was also the cost of estrangement. These two facts lived beside each other like two worn stones in a windowsill. I would sometimes handle them carefully, roll one on the other, feel their edges, and then set them down. Friends who had been silent while the story unfurled reached out with different rhythms. Some wanted to give advice about public relations. Others brought small practical help, a grocery run, a driving offer. A few relationships thinned. Someone I had considered a close friend stopped returning my calls. That thinning hurt like a small paper cut that refused to close. Work became a place of reinvention. I took on a consultancy that involved traveling lightly and speaking more about resilience than I had before. Speaking about coping with crisis required a different honesty. I found that audiences responded to specificity. Telling the truth about the cost of choices landed more than general platitudes. The public professional life felt useful, a place to convert private turbulence into lessons. Private restoration was the harder work. I spent hours cataloging and labeling possessions, creating a small archive that felt both defensive and tender. Each object received a note, date, memory, why it mattered. The archive did not erase loss. It only reminded me that the life we had built continued in fragments. Sometimes I walked to the edge of my property and sat on the curb and watched the neighborhood move on. Children played, a dog chased a squirrel, and life layered itself over the fissures. That layering comforted me in a small way. It meant the rupture was not a final erasure, but part of a palimpsest where new scripts could be written. Letters from Charlie continued to arrive sporadically, apologies, small observations from a new life, questions about a photograph, requests for a recipe. I answered some and not others. The correspondence moved slowly and without fanfare, a tentative thread that might someday become a line. In writing to him, I discovered the discipline of measured words. Anger and pleading were less effective than clear boundaries, and offered invitations to rebuild. I also made a point to build new rituals. I took a pottery class and learned to shape clay with my hands. The repetitive work soothed an acute part of grief. Shaping something by hand felt close to the care that had once been poured into the house. I began inviting neighbors over for tea on Thursdays, a habit that gently reclaimed the social space that once surrounded the family. At night I would sometimes replay the moment the police knocked on the door, the precise, administrative rap that set so many things in motion. It had been a hinge. It brought law and neighbor testimony into action, and changed trajectories. I had used the law because I believed no other tool would protect what I had built. Invoking it altered relationships irreversibly. People often asked whether I regretted my decision. The question is a knife that asks for a simple answer when none exists. I did not regret preserving a home that held my life's labor and memory. I did, however, grieve the loss of an uncomplicated family life. The two realities do not cancel one another out. In quieter moments I considered the strange alchemy of forgiveness. It involves small acts repeated over time. Calls returned, invitations accepted, a willingness to be present without preconditions. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is an ongoing choice to move forward with both memory and a willingness to be gentle. The house endured. It kept my books, my teacup, and the small marks of a life built slowly. In that endurance I found a kind of testament. Time, I realized, would not erase the past, but it might allow new patterns to grow. The silence after was not empty. It was an opportunity for rebuilding, for listening, and for the measured returns that arrive when people choose slowly to come home again. Some days I remain vigilant. Others I let the house breathe. If he returns, we will meet awkwardly. Either way, the house will hold our histories and the silence that follows will teach us. This story you've just listened to is inspired by a true life event. Certain details, names, and settings have been adapted for storytelling purposes, but the heart of the experience remains rooted in reality. Now I'd love to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this story? What would you have done if you were in the same situation? Drop your take in the comment section. I'll be going through each one.